You think emotions are human. They are, but you also think they are your guide. That is the first disconnect between how humans actually behave and how you assume they behave. Emotions are biological reactions, instinctive electrical spikes misinterpreted as truth. A smile feels like safety, a frown feels like threat, a rush of anger feels like indignation. But feelings are not evidence of causality. They are signals. And like all signals, they are subject to interpretation, exploitation, and strategic manipulation. The moment you treat emotional states as reliable ground truth, you surrender control to people who understand them differently, as tools, not truths. When someone nudges your confidence, they are not offering praise, they are demonstrating influence. When someone triggers your discomfort, they are not harming you, they are teaching you where your boundaries leak. Emotional reactions are data points in a landscape of power. The person who reacts instantly reveals the shape of their internal world. The person who does not react keeps the map obscured. You were not born learning this. You were taught that emotional expression equals integrity. It is a cultural programming, not a strategic advantage. Schools reward empathy. Narratives celebrate vulnerability. And so you carry a worldview that elevates feeling over calculation. But the social arena operates on a different currency, advantage via predictability. Think about why children cry to get attention. They do not negotiate logically. They create a disturbance. Adults respond because social structures are designed to ease discomfort, not to optimize influence. The price of comfort is not neutrality. It is control. Once caregivers learn your triggers, they manage you by them. You learn this firsthand in childhood, but you never unlearn it as an adult. You still think emotional transparency will generate trust. It sometimes does, but it always generates predictability. Predictability is the easiest form of control. A predictable person becomes a reference point in another person's model of the world. They cease to be autonomous agents and become nodes in someone else's strategy. Because when someone knows how you will react, they can frame interactions to elicit the outcome they want without direct confrontation. They shape the environment so that you voluntarily choose paths that serve their preference. That is why emotionally reactive individuals find themselves repeatedly in the same types of situations, not because life is unfair, but because their psychological landscape is visible. You think detachment means numbness. It does not. Detachment means discipline. It means observing input without uncontrolled propagation into behavior. It means separating sensation from assignment, feeling without acting on feeling reflexively. True emotional detachment is not absence of emotion. It is mastery of response. It is the ability to see emotional data clearly, analyze it strategically, and decide consciously whether to act, delay, or withhold. Predators, not in the primal violence sense, but in the strategic sense, use emotional detachment as a weapon. They do not experience less emotion. They experience less emotional leakage. They observe the tide of human reaction without letting their own vessel drift with it. This allows them to regulate pace, to shape conversation, to dictate tempo without panic. Calm is not indifference. Calm is control. Now consider why your relationships sometimes feel draining. The more emotionally transparent you are, the more energy others unconsciously extract, not necessarily overtly. Subtle needs create covert demands. Empathy invites empathy. But empathy combined with uncontrolled emotional expression invites emotional negotiation. People do not ask for your help. They ask for your emotional availability. You provide more feeling than you intend, and they build relevance around that supply. You become the emotional hub of their psychological circuit. This dynamic is not inherently wrong. It is simply strategic. The reason it feels wrong is because it assigns value to emotional exposure that is not reciprocated with containment. When you feel without boundaries, others feel entitled. They assume access. Strategic detachment removes entitlement. It does not withhold compassion. It withholds uncontrolled invitation. Once you begin observing emotional influence structurally, you realize how often reactions create leverage for others. When you immediately comfort someone, you signal that your calm can be borrowed. When you visibly flinch at a remark, you signal that territory. When you show excitement, you reveal desire. None of these are weaknesses per se. They are information. What makes them weapons is who interprets them. Most people interpret emotional signals as truth. That is their blind spot. The strategic individual interprets emotional signals as variables. Variables can be tested, modified, and utilized. That level of psychological fluidity is what separates manipulable people from unmanipulable ones. The former carry their inner world on the surface. The latter carry it invisibly, calmly, in reserve. Every emotional reaction is a vector that tells others where to apply pressure and how to extract compliance. And notice, this is not about malice. High-frequency emotional suppliers are not always exploited consciously. Sometimes the exploitation is unintentional. Emotional people exchange feeling for connection. Others connected to them learn the pattern. They do not need to be predators. They simply adapt their behavior because the pattern exists. Detachment breaks that pattern. It signals your responses are not automatic. It signals that emotional data is earned, not freely given. Humans tend to respect stability more than they respect transparency. When someone does not react as expected, the brain recalibrates. And recalibration begins with caution. Caution is a form of respect. Pause. Feel that word, respect. Not compliance, not agreement, respect. Respect is not generated by openness alone. It is generated by controlled presence. A person with a stable emotional field is more trustworthy than a person with constant emotional fluctuation, because stability implies predictability of outcome, but not predictability of reaction. Many self-help narratives tell you to express yourself fully. That may be comforting. But comfort is not control. Comfort is ease. Control comes from leverage. Anyone can express every emotion. Few can regulate responses strategically. Your task is not to feel nothing forever. That is impossible. You are human. Your nervous system will always generate sensation. Your task is to decide whether sensation becomes reaction or remains information. Sensation tucks information. Immediate reaction tucks exposure. Controlled response tucks influence. If you stop reacting instantly, you change the game. The tempo of conversation changes. People pause. They hesitate. They notice your presence as stable ground rather than variable input. That shift alone makes you harder to influence than most of the world. You may notice how often emotional exposure becomes a lever for indirect influence. This is not always malicious. Some people simply adapt to the landscape you create. If your emotional reactions are easy to predict, others subconsciously pattern their behavior around you. They don't have to consciously manipulate you, they only need to anticipate you. Predictability invites design, and design transfers influence. Strategic detachment does not require emotional suppression. Suppression is a buildup that leaks later. Suppression without integration becomes a reservoir that spills unpredictably. True detachment is not denial of feeling. It is the separation of internal state from automatic external expression. Feel deeply where necessary, but reveal intentionally where beneficial. You have been conditioned to think that emotional honesty breeds loyalty, but loyalty is not built on transparency. It is built on perceived consistency of values, not raw expression of mood. When your emotional landscape is always visible, people respond to the landscape instead of the underlying principles that guide you. And landscapes shift. Principles endure. A stable principle signals reliability. A fluctuating emotional state signals negotiability. This is why detached individuals are often mistaken for cold rather than strategic. People confuse emotional silence with emotional absence, They assume those who express less feel less. But the strategic mind operates differently. It feels fully, but filters outward signals. It chooses timing and magnitude of expression. It does not give involuntary access. Think about a storm system. You can predict the presence of storm based on indicators, but you cannot predict each flash of lightning. Lightning is reaction. The storm is pattern. Strategic detachment makes you like a storm system, powerful, present, but not reducible to reflexive flashes. Another subtle shift you will notice once you begin practicing detachment is a change in how people test you. Tests no longer escalate quickly because the emotional data stream you once provided dries up. When individuals ask loaded questions or provocations, they previously saw reactions that guided their strategy. Now they encounter a controlled, steady field. Not zero reaction, but measured response after higher-level analysis. And measurement halts opportunity. The unknown is dangerous. You begin to understand why some leaders never argue, yet still influence outcomes. Their calm itself is a weapon. Calm communicates internal structure. It communicates that input alone will not determine output. If your next move is unknown, others must adjust to you rather than vice versa. There is also a paradox in human perception. People respect composure before they respect capability. Capability signals what you can do. Composure signals who you are under pressure. Talent without composure collapses under scrutiny. Skill without detachment bends when ego enters. But composure creates a baseline, a psychological platform where influence can be exercised without giving ground. And this demands a different kind of honesty, not reflexive honesty, not emotional honesty at every moment, but strategic honesty. Choose what to reveal, when to reveal it, and how it contributes to your long-term position. The person who understands this does not stop communicating truth. They just stop broadcasting their interior world on demand. This alone begins to change how people allocate attention around you. People instinctively monitor those whose behavior has variable value. If your emotional state can shift outcomes, they watch you. But if your external state remains steady within an uncertain environment, they watch not to exploit expression, but to interpret intent. Interpretation requires effort. Effort gives you leverage. Now you must see the difference between being understood and being predictable. You can be understood partially, slowly, or only when necessary. But if you are predictable in every emotional response, you are already mapped in someone else's strategy. That means they can optimize their behavior around your reactions. That is not partnership. That is optimization for their own advantage. Once you begin to detach strategically, emotional leverage dissolves. People still feel emotions, but they feel them against you, not within you. Their emotional state becomes foreground data. Your emotional state stays calibrated. When others attempt to pull you into emotional cycles, they find nothing to latch onto. Not indifference, clarity. This is why the detached individual often wins in negotiations without confrontation. They do not need to raise stakes. Others inflate stakes when they believe emotional cost matters. The calm player knows emotional escalation reveals priority maps. If it matters to you emotionally, it can be leveraged. If it does not appear to matter emotionally, it cannot. You once battled for agreement. Strategic detachment teaches you to battle for position. Agreement is temporary. Position is structural. People agree with what they like. People follow what they cannot easily influence. Another effect you might notice is that your own internal sense of priority sharpens. When you stop broadcasting emotion reflexively, you begin noticing which situations genuinely deserve emotional investment and which are noise. Your internal radar becomes filtration rather than volume. You feel less enmeshed in social currents and more like an observer with agency. That is not detachment as numbness. It is detachment as sovereignty. And this creates a distinct internal boundary. Emotional experience becomes intentional, not impulsive. You still experience emotions, just not automatically. This difference is subtle but global in impact. The person controlled by emotion becomes predictable. The person who experiences emotion but controls expression becomes unreadable. And unreadability is influence. Once unreadability becomes your default, people begin calibrating around you instead of pulling on you. Conversations slow. Others explain themselves more. They take your lead even when you do not overtly push. That is how a calm presence translates into authority, without force, without conflict, purely by recalibrating psychological expectations. Over time, you also begin noticing how often emotional exposure was exchanged for validation. You offered feeling and received interpretation. Validation felt like connection, but connection felt like leverage. Those are different. Validation is transactional. Controlled presence is relational, but not negotiable. Strategic detachment retains relational depth without transactional vulnerability. And here is a truth many never consciously confront. If you want deeper connection, you must first preserve yourself. Emotional detachment does not prevent connection, it protects it. When your emotional field is not available as an automatic resource, others must earn access. That changes the quality of relationships. Not fewer relationships, fewer needy ones. You once believed that generosity of feeling is a form of strength. It is, but generosity without discretion is exposure disguised as strength. Strength with boundary is influence disguised as calm. That is the difference. And as you progress into detachment, you notice something else. People respond differently when they realize you are not emotionally entangled with the immediate moment. They reframe their own expectations. They speak differently. They negotiate differently. They seek your insight rather than reaction. Influence shifts from extraction to invitation. One of the quietest sources of power is this. Others believe you control your own internal world. When others assume you are self-governing, they stop steering you emotionally. That alone reduces conflict not through compromise, but through psychological respect. Eventually, you begin noticing how often emotional cues are used not to communicate truth, but to negotiate power. A slight change in tone signals concession. A quick apology signals weakness. A visible upset signals opportunity. Humans learn to read emotional fluctuation faster than logical statements because evolution trained the brain to respond to threat and reassurance before interpretation. You think you are being understood. Others are gathering information. Every emotional release is a variable in a psychological equation others solve unconsciously. Once you begin practicing detachment, people stop steering interactions based on your expressions. They begin instead to respond to your lack of reaction. This absence of reflexive emotional output forces others to reflect rather than react. And when others reflect, they reveal themselves. Reflection builds disclosure. Disclosure reveals intent. Intent becomes data. Data becomes leverage. But now it is in your hands, not theirs. This shift is not instant. At first, it feels awkward. People pause longer before addressing you. Emails go unanswered for a moment. Conversations have more silence. But silence here is not withdrawal. Silence is strategic pressure. It forces information to surface on its own terms. Others attempt to fill the silence with their own emotional content, because silence feels like a vacuum that must be occupied. But occupation reveals priorities rather than hiding them. You also begin to notice how often emotional detachment makes others overly cautious. They do not know whether your lack of reaction means indifference, calculation, or opportunity. That ambiguity works as psychological friction. Friction slows others down, and slower opponents give you the advantage. In negotiation, there is a concept called the anchor. The first number on the table influences the final outcome disproportionately. Emotional detachment anchors conversations in unpredictability. Others cannot estimate your position